I have this theory that every major artist falls into one of three categories. First, there are the writers, then the vocalists, and last, the performers. And obviously, all of these artists are incredible at all three. You could not be as successful as they are without it. But if you think back to the early years, I feel like they really focus on the foundation of their artistry being centered around one of these three things. First is the writers, where they build this foundation of their music on this ability they have to tell a story through song in a way that no one else can do on their level in their specific way. Second is the vocalist, where the range of their voice is just so absolutely insane that you can tell they craft a lot of their songs around that fact or this big payoff vocal moment at the end. Last is the performers, where their ability to create a story comes through the visual. They center their music around this performance in a way that is completely unprecedented. So much so that oftentimes you can't fully even understand the music until you have watched the video or seen a performance. And again, every artist does all three. I almost think of it like a skill tree in a video game, right? Like you start out as like a power type or speed type or defense type, but then like as you level up, you acquire all these skills in these different things, right? Take somebody like Beyonce, for example, a world-renowned vocalist, right? But do I think someone like Mariah Carey is capable of hitting a note that Beyonce can hit? Probably. Do I think somebody like Mariah Carey could do the Coachella performance that Beyonce delivered? Absolutely not, right? So to me, Beyonce is this pinnacle of performance. She is a master vocalist as well, but like in my mind, like her deepest, most iconic moments are somehow always tied to this concept of a visual. Then you can look at somebody like Celine Dion, for example. One of the most iconic pieces and consistently viral of her artistry is these outfit reveals she did at every single performance. However, the biggest piece of her legacy is and always will be her unreal capability as a vocalist. It's not that one is really better or worse than the other, but you can kind of feel how these artists intentionally center themselves around one of these three specific skill sets. Which got me thinking, how does one even create that persona? How do they shift this perception of themselves from one thing to another? And what can aspiring artists learn from legends like this to implement these things themselves? Well, that is exactly the question we set out to solve here today. I thought it would be interesting to do a three-part series dissecting each element of the artist persona, studying the icons within that category, but then also the new people breaking through to determine exactly what it takes to get there. Welcome back to Nicky at Night. I am your host, Nicky Reardon, and this week we are breaking down the performer persona. This entire video was actually inspired by a TikTok that I made a very long time ago, talking about this way that I have always categorized artists in my mind. It's heard a lot of very intense discourse in the comments of people being like, no, Beyonce's a vocalist, and no, this person's this, blah, 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 blah. And what's interesting to me about it is like, I think if you get to this level of like a top, 100, 200 artist, whatever, like you have to do all three and you're great at all three, right? Like they're going on tours across the globe. They're writing music every year. They're delivering these vocal performances. Like it is a requirement to do it all. But I think when you really, again, going back to these origin stories, it is fascinating to me how I feel like they really lean into one in the beginning. And once they are known for that thing, they then start to like layer and add these elements in this way that is so awesome. And it's a really interesting thing, I think, for especially for new artists to really think about is like identifying what that thing is and how do you master that thing to the best of your capability before you want to move on to the next thing. It's again, it's literally like like a skill tree in a video game. You want to like max out your skill of the thing that you're best at before you start to develop these other things. And the performer was really interesting to me because I think that we are really seeing this big resurgence of performers right now, as I'll dive into with a lot of these examples I have later on with people like Sabrina, Tate McRae, Doja Cat, also these very all-around artists, like I would say like Doechii and Chapel, massive performers and very iconic performances. I feel like this year of 2024 into 2025, we're really seeing performers take a big step on the stage. And I've just been thinking about them a lot, so that would be interesting to talk about. But another interesting element with this performance is that not all performance has to be dance. I think a lot of the times when we think of a performer, it is a dancer. And oftentimes that is true. They can be synonymous. However, a performer to me is this combination of visual identity. It is music videos, it is fashion, it is hair and makeup, it is their sense of humor, it is an aesthetic they adhere to. To me, the performance is visual storytelling. It is how they amass all of these things to create one coherent persona that the audience can then see themselves reflected in and latch on to those aspects of. And, again, like even thinking about incredible performances, like I think can even be things where the artist is completely standing still and in a music video, right? Like I think that the When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go music video of like Billie Eilish crying ink was such a visual performance, right? It is not her being this massive dancer. She is trained as a dancer, but then she got injured as a kid and can't dance like that anymore. But it was this visual tied to the song that made you understand the world of the artist deeper and better. And I wouldn't classify Billie as a performer. I think I would classify her as a vocalist. But just to understand this idea of what I mean when I talk about a performance, and many of these things that I'll reference later on are not only tied to them standing on a stage dancing. It can be so much more than that in a way that's very, very cool. So with that, I think it's important to acknowledge like who are really the OG performers, I would say, that set the blueprint for the modern era of music that we are in. And to me, there were three names that instantly came to mind: Michael Jackson, Britney Spears, and Beyonce. These three defined the era of music that we live in to this day. Subsequently, for the past 40 years, honestly, music has been defined by these three artists, and we are still living in the era of these three artists, which is pretty insane. When you think back to Michael Jackson, for example, right? Jackson 5 debuted in 1969. His first solo album was in 1972. And while he was debuting, especially as a kid, he was very renowned for his vocals, and he is this incredible vocalist. However, I would argue that Michael Jackson really defined what it meant to build a world as an artist. The fashion, the music videos, dancing, the vocal performance, he could do it all. And most importantly, tie it all into one cohesive narrative. When you think of something like the Thriller music video, for example, right? One of the most iconic music videos of all time. MTV really hit its peak in the 80s. That was when the boom of this music video happened. Thriller releases in 1982. So when you think about this idea of music being a visual experience, Michael Jackson really pioneered that in many ways, or at the very least pioneered it in the way that we think about it now. This idea that music, especially at its discovery point, is no longer an auditory only experience. Music is a spectator sport. We see it, whether that is you are scrolling on social media, whether it's that you are watching a YouTube video, whether that you get surfaced a concert clip, whether you are out at the club dancing with your friends and seeing how people move their bodies in response to something. We are very drawn to this visual identity of this art form that is inherently only audio, which is very fascinating. And I think Michael Jackson was one of the first to understand that. And I think he really defined that individuality was cool. It was cool to do something nobody else was doing, especially, again, from these visual perspectives. Like when you think of some of the biggest artists of the 80s, it's like Madonna and Guns N' Roses, and they had these massive iconic music videos, but Michael Jackson felt so far removed from that. I mean, I even think of, his iconic dance style and, doing like the moonwalk. Like he wasn't interested in this idea of conformity. I don't think he was looking at what these other artists were doing. I think he was excited by this idea of his own creative expression, and he didn't conform to the trends, he defined them. And I think that was this really fascinating thing about Michael Jackson, and also just being like the pop boy for decades. It was been very far and few between we have seen a man in music adhere that title for that long, which segues us into Britney Spears. And Britney Spears has defined all pop music of the past 2 decades. Her first ever debut record went diamond, which is 10 times platinum, which was Baby One More Time. And she really was known as being this performer's performer. Like even at the beginning of her career, Michael Jackson co-signed and even talked about how he thought she was going to be one of the most iconic performers of this generation. Other artists admired her because of her raw stage presence. And that is really what I think built this persona around her so quickly, was that even if you didn't know who she was or think she was cool to the coolest person you knew. So it created the sense of this borrowed credibility where people were always like, well, who is she? What is she doing? Why is it like that? And she made everything a performance. Again, really leaning into these different themes and costumes, And one thing, she's bringing a snake on stage and being a snake trainer. And then the next, she's a schoolgirl. And then the next, she's a flight attendant. Like, she really leaned into the music video being this cinematic experience, I would argue. Again, like having its own set and design and world. And what's so interesting about Britney is that she set this very dangerous blueprint for child stardom. Not of her own fault, but her success made people in the industry obsessed with recreating this replica. I mean, she debuted at 16 years old and was really known for her sex appeal, which is a scary thing. Like, her first music video is her dressed as this, sexy schoolgirl in a crop top and a mini skirt. And it was meant to toe this line of being PG while also being fantasy, which is a very terrifying and kind of disgusting thing to think about when we're talking about a teenage girl. And also is very fascinating how much I think music of this time was generated for the male gaze. It was really like, what does the man think of a woman? How do we make this woman this piece of desire for a man? Whereas I would argue that music in the 2020s is so much towards the female gaze, so much towards, do the girls and gays like you? So much towards the biggest artists in the world are all female, And that is so interesting how much we have seen that pendulum swing in just like 20 years-ish. And I think a big part of that is due to the internet. But Britney really was that blueprint. And people became obsessed with it. It is why, she originally came from Disney. She was on the Mickey Mouse Club with her, Christina Aguilera, Justin Timberlake, and Ryan Gosling. And after all of them became so successful, Britney was the first to be that successful. Disney became obsessed with trying to create the next Britney Spears. It is why Hilary Duff was a show. It is why they created Hannah Montana, where her entire thing was to be a blonde pop star, right? Because Britney Spears was the one that got away for Disney Channel. So this entire generation that we grew up of, you think of the Mileys, the Selenas, the Demis, then after that, the Sabrina Carpenters, Zendaya, Olivia Rodrigo, these people who came from this Disney pipeline was all centered around this idea of trying to recreate Britney. And I think what's also very fascinating about Britney's success is that Britney was not a vocalist. In fact, her sort of baby voice sound was done on purpose. That is not actually her raw singing voice. This was something that her team and Max Martin, who's one of the greatest producers of all time, had kind of crafted with her, of wanting her to sound young and a little, like baby, I guess is really the way that it worked. And it's interesting that really resonated with people so well. And I also think what was fascinating about the Britney blueprint was, one, doing young stars for young audiences, right? So now the music artist is the same age as the fandom. And two, it was really cementing this idea of how much of music is about the visual. And that if somebody is an incredible performer and has banger songs, it honestly doesn't really matter if they're a good singer or not. Like, they cannot be even singing to their highest singing capability. But if the rest of it is coherent and exciting, audiences will latch on to that. And I think that's really something fascinating that Britney Spears kind of proved. And then we get to Beyonce. And did you know that Beyonce and Britney Spears debuted within less than a year of each other and then went on to define pop music for the subsequent 3 decades? Like, we are still in this era. Destiny's Child debuted in November of 1997, whereas Britney Spears, Maybe One More Time, debuted in 1998. Then we see Beyonce's solo debut, which was Crazy in Love in 2003. And this went absolutely insane, I think, because it, one, had this iconic dance, but two, this renowned vocal run from Beyonce. From day one, I think she really showed that she was this triple threat. And Beyonce's greatest skill as an artist is her ability to execute a vision. Every album has a clear thesis statement, whether that is challenging the norms of a genre like country music and its history of racism towards her acceptance in that genre, or whether it is talking about being forced to make lemonade out of some very bitter lemons when your partner cheats on you and you feel like your world is crumbling around you. She has a vision, no matter what. And the vocals, the performance, the music videos are this amplification of that vision. You know, like Lemonade, I think, is her best, most stunning visual era. And I remember like these music videos of her underwater when she felt suffocated and trapped in this relationship of like knowing what this man did to her and how much that even almost challenged her own self-esteem. But at the end of the day, she pushes that aside and, you know, walks out and we see this big reveal of all the water crashing behind her and her finding her confidence again. And not being afraid, I think also to be so raw and vulnerable was like what at Lemonade moved me so much. You know, it's so common for people in the public eye to get into these very like public disputes and do anything they can to repress them. And I think what was beautiful about an album like Lemonade is Beyonce was like, no, I am in this very deep emotional pain point, one of the lowest I've ever been in my entire life. I don't know if my relationship's going to make it. And like, that is something to make art about. That is something to explain my emotions, to walk through the ways that I'm feeling. And it was so beautiful. And again, like, I think also interesting thing about Beyonce is that she is really the only of these three to transcend into the digital era. Obviously, Michael Jackson has passed away, rest in peace, and Britney Spears has had a lot of trauma and people abusing her, which is, again, it would be its whole video on its own thing. I'm not trying to ignore it. It's just like, I don't want to like spread misinformation, and that is a very complicated legal thing, but it's something I would definitely be interested in doing a video on someday. Which brings us to these new age performers. And when I think about a lot of this new age performers, I think of Sabrina Carpenter, I think of Doja Cat, I think of Lady Gaga, I think of Tate McRae as some of this like big new age. Lady Gaga is like a transition period. Doja Cat was like right at the start of this digital boom. And then Sabrina and Tate really like this past year. I also think honorable mention again to people like Doechii and Chapel. I don't know. I decided not to include them in this video just because one, I've made entire episodes dedicated to both of them already, and how I think both of them are, it is so rare to see an artist that just from day one has this level of all three, that they can write so much of their own music and do it flawlessly, that they can just get on a stage and captivate hundreds of thousands of people, that they can have these incredible big vocal powerhouse moments in their music. Like, it's very hard to find somebody like that. Again, you know, like, I think we have like Beyonce who did it. I think we've had Doechii and Chapel. I think Billy sort of. It's just rare. It's just so rare to see an artist have all three in the beginning. So I really want to talk about like, what is this definition of the performer? Also, an honorable mention I think is interestingly is K-pop. It is very fascinating to me. Also, I like to say I'm not like a K-pop stan. Like, I like some K-pop songs. I'm not like in K-pop, right? But it was very fascinating to me. I was actually talking to one of my friends who he's from the Philippines, went to the Philippines a few months ago. And he hadn't been there in a while. And anytime my friends go out of the country, I always ask them like, what music is playing there? Because it's fascinating to hear to me like who does well in different markets. And something he had said that was so fascinating to me was he was like, it is only performers. It was so much Sabrina. It was so much Tate. It was Doja Cat. It was Lady Gaga. He's like, I really didn't hear as much of like the Olivia Rodrigos and the Billie Eilishes. And I thought that was so fascinating. He said he thought it's because so much of Asian music, especially the Eastern Asian music scene, is like so heavily influenced by K-pop and its derivatives. And even when I was watching, I don't know if you guys have watched the Cat's Eye documentary, Popstar Academy. It's so good on Netflix. It's actually so fascinating. And how much emphasis these labels like Hype and K-pop labels put into developing artists from raw performance. Like, they would have entire classes dedicated to the facial expressions they make while on stage, and how much of these choreographies are planned so that if it's one person's verse that they're singing, they are sneakily snuck to the back of the lineup and the other four are dancing in front of them so that person can stand still and catch their breath and deliver the vocal, so then the next person can phase in and then they can go back out and dance. Like, it's very fascinating how much of these things are planned out for the performance that we don't even realize. And I think like it's an art form. It is truly, truly an art form. But starting with, I think like these, when we get into, you know, late 2000s, early 2010s, no artist comes to mind more than Lady Gaga. What's so fascinating about Lady Gaga's rise to stardom is that she became mainstream by rejecting the mainstream. Her entire persona is built off of this idea of pushing societal norms to the brink and showing how much of our society is built off of this idea of shame. Like, there is no actual rule that says you can't wear a meat dress to an award show or hash out of an egg at the Grammys. The only reason people don't do that is because, oh, what would they think? Oh, that would be so weird. But Lady Gaga's driving force as an artist was to challenge that norm and realize once you let go of this idea of shame and what people think of you, you can literally do anything. One of my favorite Gaga quotes is the iconic, like, I didn't become famous. I was born famous. It just took people this long to figure it out. And by doing this, it is almost a rejection of authority, rejection of these institutions that govern our lives, that we feel we have to act or adhere a certain way to maintain the status quo of that institution. When she debuted, her entire look was this sort of postmodern, futuristic caricature of a pop star, taking inspiration from artists like David Bowie, Madonna, and Cher. She brought camp into the mainstream of the 2000s. And what's fascinating is people view her as kind of not a serious artist. Despite her being classically trained, having even written songs in the past for artists as big as Britney Spears. So she was a talented artist who had done multiple things. However, that became the perception of her. So once that became the norm, she had to reject that once again. With albums like Born This Way having a lot more directly political writing about queer acceptance, Joanne being this big shift in style, her doing things like American Horror Story and then A Star Is Born, Gaga really proved that she was a generational talent beyond this gimmick that people viewed her as. However, that was integral to who she is and her identity and this idea of the performance. After this, Shallow became her biggest song in the streaming era, has over 2.7 billion streams. So once that became this perception of her, this generational talent, this artist, and this thing like A Star Is Born, she rejected the norm again. And that's where Chromatica comes in. And now we have Mayhem, where it seems like she's kind of starting to sit in between all of that, where, you know, a song like Die of the Smile feels very A Star Is Born, yet Abracadabra feels more art prop and Chromatica. And what's fascinating to me about Gaga is she is this personification of rejecting the status quo. That is her performance. Her performance is to be this reactionary figure towards challenging what people are thinking and feeling and the normalcy that exists in our world. There's this one quote that I love, and it's a tweet I saw. It says, "The people you admire most are people exactly like you, except they are wholly aware you can just do things." I love this quote. It's been going around on Twitter right now. It's like, you can really just do stuff. And like, free will is a crazy thing, dude. Like, you can literally do anything. So much of our society is built off of these weird social norms, you know? Like, I could walk outside right now and take a shit on the sidewalk. I'm not saying I would do that. I'm not saying it would be a good idea, but like, that is free will. I could. And like, honestly, nothing would happen, right? Like that, it is this weird thing. Like, you can just do stuff. Once you let go of this idea of shame and the box of society that has been drawn around you, the sky is the limit. And that, I think, is really what is beautiful about like what Gaga did in this era, especially as so much of that, again, 2000s music became so formulaic. People obsessed with the idea of trying to recreate the next Britney, recreate the next Beyonce, recreate the next Michael Jackson. Lady Gaga came in as this rejection of that thing. And when I think of somebody else who has really done that is Doja Cat. Doja Cat is one of the greatest performers of our generation because her entire life is the performance. Her going to a fashion show painted red, bedazzled in Swarovski diamonds because she was releasing a song called Paint the Town Red. Even down to the Moo video, which she first blew up on. It was satirical, it was ironic, but that humor is who she is authentically as a person. And that humor is part of the performance. It is no surprise to me that her first ever viral moment is something tied to this concept of a very maximalist visual. And I find it very reminiscent of Lady Gaga, where I think a big part of her motivation as an artist is to challenge that status quo, especially when it comes to her physical appearance. And I think that is why we see her doing things like dressing up as a worm, painting herself red, shaving her eyebrows and her head. It is this very reactionary method of art to the way people talk about her. Like when they said that she was a bad person, when she said she didn't love every single one of her fans. So she literally became a demon in a music video, right? Is taking this perception, taking it to the absolute most maximalist extreme and using that to push back against the narrative of how people are discussing her. I feel like one of the greatest moments of this was her Coachella performance, wearing clothes made entirely out of hair, dancers wearing hair, her wig being this long and blonde, beautiful hair, which I think is meant to represent the male gaze, how a man wants this female performer to be the blonde bombshell, to be oogled and awed at. So Doja rejects that. Halfway through, she rips off the wig and just shows her bald head, saying, I understand who you want me to be, but this is who I am, and I am here. And Doja has, I think, mastered this art of every great performance tells a story. And also, every great performance is not just done on a stage. The performance is a lifestyle. Performance is a commitment to who this persona is, who this character is, you know? And they are willing to show up as that. She's willing to paint herself literally red head to toe and talk these ways in interviews and dress as a worm, whatever, because that is what she stands for. That is the story. It is rejecting this norm. And that doesn't mean she can only reject the norm on a stage or in a music video. It is this essence of her personality. And then when you think of a more modern performer, I think one of the greatest examples is Sabrina Carpenter. Sabrina Carpenter is the blueprint for an artist finding persona and how everything just clicked. It all started with the nonsense outros, right? For the first time, it was her being overtly sexual and risque. So it went viral the first time, so she makes it a series, right? Does it on every single stop of the tour. Then the song Feather really blows up, which is her being this unapologetic flirt, not pining over the boy, but saying the boy should be in love with me. I'm the hot one, right? And then Espresso perfectly combines both of those things, right? It's a little sexual, a little risque, but it's also that me espresso and he's thinking about me every night. Ooh, like Espresso, it's just A plus B equals C. And it was her biggest song of all time. And then she ran with it. She built an entire album centered on this wit and sense of humor with things like Bedchem and the camaraderie line or the Juno poses. Like the album is literally called Short and Sweet. She leaned into this identity of being the pint-sized pop star. It hones in on this signature look with the little heart cutouts, the mini skirt, the platform heels. The performances is like this 60s inspired television program. And what's so beautiful about Sabrina's evolution is that she didn't plan it. It just happened because it was authentic to her. She just thought it would be funny to do that nonsense outro one time, and it worked. And if you watch these interviews with her, like just a normal interview, I think you will really understand that she's genuinely like that. Like that is authentic to her. She is witty and has this sort of like a corny but funny and dry like sense of humor where she loves to throw these little one-liners in. And I'm sure that there were many people who told her like, hey, you have this really big Disney audience and I'm not sure you can say, come right on me in your next album. But it was her letting go of that, her not being afraid to lean into this very real signal she was getting from the internet that completely exploded her career. And when she tried to appeal to less people, she ended up appealing to more people, right? She didn't focus so hard on being this product of Disney and perfectly brand safe. She did what was true and authentic and what she thought was funny and what she thought was interesting, and that worked. And I think that that is a really beautiful thing. You know, Sabrina to me is this personification of the power of persona, right? Her costumes, you see how like every single outfit just makes sense, and then how she can do a fashion show on a runway, or it's this very 60s inspired look and it makes sense, or her doing the Dunkin' Donuts espresso commercial and how it's, you know, this pun about like shaking ass, whatever. Like it so makes sense. You look at all these things she does. The nonsense Christmas special, I thought, was another great example. It does not feel like Sabrina is conforming to the thing. It feels like the thing is conforming to Sabrina. And that is the power of a well thought out, well defined persona. It's so easy to slot these things into because it's so clear what her visual is, what her sense of humor is. And those things, they just write themselves around that fact. Another interesting thing I like to think about with this concept of an artist persona, while not people I would label as performers, I would label them both as writers, is Charli XCX and Lana Del Rey. What I find so fascinating about Charli XCX is like she is not really a performer in the traditional sense, right? Like she is not a dancer. She is not having 30 background dancers with her on stage. Like that is not what she does. Her persona is the performance, right? She is the party girl, 365 party girl. She's making this electronic music. It's jumping up and down. You play it at a rave, right? And what is so fascinating to me about this entire Brat rollout is that Charli did not appear alone even once. Whether that was the Boiler Room set, whether that was the Brat Wall, whether that was the pop-up performances, whether that was Times Square performance, whether that was her at the Grammys even, right? It is not alone. Billie was alone. Sabrina was alone with a few backup dancers. Charli is the party girl. Where she goes, the party girls. By never being alone, it made this persona of like, she can't even escape the party. Like everywhere she goes, like people are just wanting, like everywhere she went was a party. So that created this subconscious symbol of like, okay, like when I'm out dancing, when I'm getting ready, blah, 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 like I want to listen to Charli. And that to me is such a fascinating thing of this, again, this manipulation of the perception from the audience and how much these tiny little things can affect an artist's persona. Again, like Charli just is the party girl, so everything is a party. Everything she does has to be a party, or else it's not her. It doesn't feel right. And I think like the Grammys was this perfect example of that, right? It's not even professional dancers. It's not some big choreographed thing. She is the cool girl's cool girl. The coolest girl you know loves Charli. It's why she has Gabrielle and Emma Chamberlain and Julia Fox. Like those are the people she's referencing and in her music videos even. And that was what is masterful about her persona to me, despite not being this traditional performer. Another great example of this, I think, is Lana Del Rey. Lana Del Rey is this persona of the past. She does not try to be trendy and keep up with this ever-changing things. She romanticizes this long gone era of her upbringing. You know, if you think about the opposite of what is trendy and current, I would say that it's the past and what is timeless. You know, this idea of what an aesthetic is of the 50s or 60s or 70s has been cemented. Like the past is set in stone already. So her doing that has made that she has kind of created this immortal image around her because these things personify themselves in everyday life. And I think what's so interesting about Lana too is her superpower to just be this poet that romanticizes the mundane. You know, like Lana Del Rey could do a music video inside of a laundromat and it would make sense, right? Or it's why her being at a Waffle House is so funny and viral, right? It is because her life that she has built is, what if everything is a work of art? What if everything I do is built off of this idea of romanticizing where I came from, what I love, what art and media inspired me? It's why her music videos are in black and white and so stoic. Or, you know, like her persona is so interesting to me, I think, because it is this antithesis of what a pop star should be. It is this antithesis of what is popular and new and current and trendy. But by doing that, it made her this category of one. It felt like there was no competitor or equal to Lana Del Rey, especially when you think about her debut. You know, now I would say we have like an Ethel Cain and like a Billie who are very inspired in this route, but to this day, it feels like Lana is just Lana. And I think that's a very fascinating thing about this persona she has built. And then when you think about like the most modern idea of a performer, I think Tate McRae is a perfect example. Tate McRae is so Britney Spears coded, and it has been so long since we saw an artist actually able to replicate that because many has tried, but she is a performer's performer. Like, I guarantee there is an artist you love who has shared a video of Tate McRae on their Instagram story talking about how insane it is that she did something in that music video. And I think it has also been so long since we had young artists, which is a very important thing, right? Think of our generation growing up. We had Taylor, Ariana, Miley Cyrus, Demi, Selena. All of these people were teenagers relatively at the same time we were teenagers, right? Like, give or take, 5 years or so. And when you think of the biggest artists of today, they are still Taylor Swift and Beyonce and Ariana Grande. Like, it is fascinating to me that the kids of today are listening to 30-year-olds. When we were kids, we were listening to other kids relatively our same age. And that's also why I think, the debut of an artist like Olivia Rodrigo took off so much and as rapidly as it did was because a song like Driver's License, right? It's like such a teenager problem. This idea of getting your first driver's license, this idea of a very like high school romance, your very, very ever first heartbreak and how it feels like the end of the world. Like, that is not a song a Taylor Swift could have written, right? Taylor Swift writing about her driver's license as like a 30-year-old woman would feel a little weird. A 17-year-old writing about her driver's license feels so right. It is so relatable and empathetic to a young audience. And specifically, when I think of like Olivia and Billie, the rises of them, I think that's one of the things that felt so exciting to their audiences and fandoms. Because it's like, oh my God, I, love Ariana Grande and Taylor Swift and blah, blah, blah. But like, it is so awesome that there is an artist who like has relatively similar life experiences and is the same age and can reference things that I remember. And you know what I mean? Like, that is this really fascinating thing. And I think Tate is another great example of that. She's 21. And she is, I think, the first like young, new artist to really lean into this performer persona, right? The fashion and the music videos feel very cinematic in a way that Britney was. There's a very concrete theme. Britney loves to be a pilot and then be at a school and then have a snake and blah, 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 right? There was always some sort of like theme that felt like it was a scene from a movie, and one movie could be Indiana Jones and the next is Interstellar and the next is blah, 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 right? Like, they weren't always the same thing, but there was this clear, coherent storyline. And I think that is something that Tate has really been able to do, as well as also just like her performances, her ability as a dancer is insane. Like, she was a famous dancer before she was a famous music artist. And I also think people really love her personality. What's so interesting about this internet age of the artist is there's the veil between who the artist is and their ability to communicate with the fandom is the thinnest it has ever been. And I think people really started falling in love with her when she started like going on podcasts like Jake Shane and stuff like that. Like, they just enjoyed her as a person. She was just a cool young girl that they can aspire to, who is relatively their age. And you know what I mean? It's exciting. And for people like generally my age, I'm 25, who like remember Britney Spears from their youth, like, Tate feels somehow nostalgic and new at the same time. And I think that is a very hard line to toe. But when you do it well, it is, the sky is the limit. Similarly, I would even say how Olivia Rodrigo, I think, felt very like nostalgic and new of like almost Taylor Swift and Hayley Williams at the same time. Like, she can be this sad poetic songwriter, but also this teen angst pop punk girl. Another interesting thing I think about Tate's rise too was like she really leaned into these aspects of community and fandom. I think the first just being dance. Like, dance is a very large community. It is a sport that people dedicate years of their lives to, travel across the country to do these competitions. And she got her first initial rise from So You Think You Can Dance. And I think Tate is really, so much of her core fans, like people I know who are the biggest Tate fans ever, are dancers, which I think is a really interesting thing. Like, they really aspire to her for that element. I also think she leaned into her interests in a way that was very cool. She is Canadian. She has this love of sports. So like, her doing a performance at the NHL and her really, a lot of her fashion being like wearing a jersey, I think was really cool. Again, also I think it plays into this idea of dance being this aspect of athleticism. It is a sport, a very difficult sport to do. And it is not always taken seriously in the same way as that. And I love the idea of this like very like hot dancer girl wearing a jersey, because it almost plays the idea of like, I am doing something right now your favorite athlete cannot do. And I think that that's really cool, this subconscious sort of messaging. And again, she has this very stark visual, a uniform you can wear. There's so many things that would make sense, right? That like cheetah print from like the sports car music video, or like again the jersey and the shorts, or the revolving door music video with like the white and the white heels, blah blah blah. Like there's so many things that you can really see reflected in Tate from a visual perspective. I also think another interesting thing about her is that she's really mastered this line of towing sexual and PG, which I think is a really interesting thing when you have a very young fandom, but also you aren't necessarily that young anymore. So you don't want your music to be like turned off by somebody's mom, but also you do want to feel like you're writing to who you are now as a person. And like a song like Sports Car is the perfect example, right? It feels more sexual than any Sabrina Carpenter song, but lyrically, it is not at all, right? Like Sports Car says things like, ain't got no misses, but you got a sports car. We can in it while you drive it real far. You know what it is. We can share one seat with the windows rolled down. Like, you know what she's talking about, but she's not saying the thing, which I think is a really funny and interesting thing, that a song like that can be completely safe for radio play. It can be completely safe for just, like young girls, or like it's not so directly I think that like somebody who has not had those types of experiences will not really fully grasp like what she's saying and why she's saying it in a way that would make it fine for them, which I think is a really interesting line to toe. Again, whereas Sabrina is like aesthetically and sonically feels so like la-di-da-di-da pop princess in a way that should be more kid friendly, but is saying, come right on me. So like, interesting split there. I think it's super interesting in the way these like two modern performers have gone different ways about that. And then the interesting thing is like, I would argue that like one of the only criticisms people have of Tate is her vocal capability. Like people really don't like the sort of lispy baby sound, which is funny because it's also the same criticism that Britney got, but in hindsight and retrospect, like people love that about Britney. You know what I mean? It's just this weird thing that is like interesting again too. I think again, it's like she is not trying to be a vocalist. I think she's trying to make like fun, hot pop music. And that's not necessarily needed for that. It also, I would argue again, like a song like Sports Car, the entire point of it is to be like whispery and like sexy in that way. It's not a singing thing. Again, not that I don't love vocalists. I do. Like, I would argue probably my favorite artist of all time is like Billie Eilish. So, but I understand what she's doing and I see the vision. And I think that's, again, like something I always say, like the artists who don't make it aren't artists that you dislike the vision of. They're artists that you can't see the vision of at all. That is this really interesting thing I have always noticed is it doesn't matter whether you specifically like it. If somebody else out there can see it and get it, then there is a community and an audience for it. The people who struggle are people who, what is the vision? Like I think that to compare someone like Tate to what happened with like Dua Lipa on this most recent album. Like I love Dua Lipa's music, but like the storyline was so, I don't get it. I did not like understand one comprehensive story. I understand what the mantra she was going for, radical optimism in this face of like when shit is hitting the fan in your life, to be this like, well, I gotta focus on the factors that I can control, and I'm gonna have this radical optimism. Like I get it, but I just don't think any of the music videos relayed that message. I don't think what do you wear to a Dua Lipa concert? Right? I can tell you what I would wear to Sabrina Carpenter. I can tell you what I'd wear to Olivia Rodrigo. I can tell you what I've worn to Billie Eilish. I would have no idea what to wear to a Dua Lipa concert. There is no concrete visual. It is good. What she is doing is good. But again, there is not this thing I can latch onto. And when I don't get it, when I don't see it, that is always when I've noticed the artist has a flop era. It's not whether it's I like it or dislike it. It's whether can I understand it. And this lack of understanding, I think, is the most important thing. And going back to the original thesis of this entire video is that this idea of an artist persona, whether you are a performer or a writer or a vocalist, is that your goal is to tell a story. Great songs are great stories. Your goal as an artist is to create this movement of emotion and emotional expression through song. And that is what stories are. And to be a great artist, you have to be a great storyteller. There's no right or wrong way to do that, right? Some people are very good at just very poetically sitting with a pen and paper and they can have a story in their life and write about it. Some people convey that pain through the emotion of their voice and the vocal and their ability to deliver these just powerful moments. And some people craft that sort of story and visual through what it is to be a performer in music videos and performances and dance and blah, blah, blah. So with that, let me guys know if you like the topic of this video. And if so, I can do a part 2 and part 3 on vocalists and writers and really some artists who I think have really pioneered those sorts of fields as to what it takes to be a musician. Also, next week's episode will be a guest episode, which is very, very exciting. So we are so close to our goal of 100,000 subscribers. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Also, follow us on Spotify, follow on Apple, listen to it on your car ride to the gym, listen to me at work. I don't care. I won't tell your boss. And I'll see y'all next week.